that. Will you guys be able to see me still, or?
Yes, I can. You're just on the side. Can everybody else still see Chris? Yeah. Okay. You're good to go.
Excellent. Just in case I want to use some of my props. Alrighty. First of all, I would like to invite you to do the following. Shah has kindly said that we would have 5 minutes at the end to kind of like answer some questions you might have. And I just thought I'm just going to include these 5 minutes into the whole presentation, and I invite you to ask questions if they do arise. And I really want you to kind of like make this content personally meaningful. So I'd really appreciate if you just shout out if you've got something there that you would like to ask. Alrighty, so the topic today is worrying as a hobby. I think if you're anything like me, then it's one of your many hobbies. Because at the end of the day, worrying is closely related to our values as well. We tend to, as conscientious women, we tend to worry about what we value, which is fantastic on the one hand, but also, is a reason to stress out sometimes as well. Alrighty, so how to find more peace of mind? Let's do this. So Shah, if you could just swipe over to the next slide. I made the attempt at drawing a brain there. I think whenever you have to point out it's a brain, you haven't done a really good job, but that's okay. So, a marvelous brain with the desire to keep us alive. My lens, the lens I view the world through, is essentially how does our brain work and why is it the way it is. And at the end of the day, our brain, which is miraculous, has developed over so many dozens and hundreds of years. And I think what really helps to kind of like give us a bit of peace of mind sometimes is a bit of self-compassion when it comes to understanding where we come from. Okay, so what do I mean by that? At the end of the day, our brain's default mechanism is our negativity bias. It has kept us safe for centuries to assume the worst. That's essentially what has kept us alive. That's the reason why we're still breathing today as a species, so to say. The negativity bias is also something that is extensively used in advertising and as well as in public relations. So, you know, as soon as you've got that bad news story, people buy your newspaper, right? So it's something that is greatly taken advantage of when it comes to advertising as well. But let's go back a little bit more, and let's go back to the savannah, you know, back in the day when we were still living together in villages. And there were two sorts of people, right? And the one person was like, oh man, it's a beautiful day. I think something great and exciting is going to happen. And he hears kind of a weird noise in the bushes. And he's like, oh, it's probably like a beautiful new animal that I've never seen before. And bam, animal comes out. And of course, this person is eaten by the saber-toothed tiger. So guess what? That person never actually got to spread on the genes that were beautiful in the way that they were the anti-worry genes, so to say. So unfortunately, that person is no longer around. So instead, our ancestors are the kind of people that went out on the same beautiful day and something, you know, was making noise in the bushes, and that person just were like, oh my God, what's happening? And just ran off, you know, and while that person was still running, essentially, that person saw this beautiful lady just running away from something scary as well. And they too made eye contact, and boom, you know, next generation of warriors came to be. And that's unfortunately the people that we come from, but also luckily the people that we come from, because at the end of the day, worrying is what keeps us safe in many situations. However, by now, it has also become something that makes us very unsafe. And I'm going to be talking about cortisol and how that impacts our body in a mere moment. Usually this content is something that I kind of like teach in a workshop setting over a couple of hours. So I'm going to give you just a few kind of like, you know, points here and there of the topics that I find interesting within the bigger topic. But I'm just going to give you a brief moment to ask, are you still with me? Mm-hmm. Any questions so far? That's so much. no, I can't hear anything, so I'm just gonna continue. So
I did unmute them for just a moment, Chris, and nothing came up. So I will mute them again.
Alrighty, no worries. On the topic, right? Yeah. So usually when I do an extended workshop on this, I start off by the following. I read out this sentence saying, things we interpret to be scary and the reason to worry become that by our interpretation. The ability to take a step back and find out why we worry gives us mental capacity back. So I usually do a whole piece on what are sort of like individually meaningful worries to us, which is deeply rooted in values, but also it's deeply rooted in how we perceive and make sense of the world around us. And then we talk a whole heap about the interpretation of our environment. So that sounds a bit abstract right now, but I just want to leave this idea with you anyways, because just this notion of that something is not necessarily something that is worth worrying about, but becomes it by us interpreting it as something that's worth worrying about. So, just gonna leave that there for you. And go over to the piece that I cannot not share with you, which is the idea of the vicious cycle of cortisol. Charlene, if you could just switch to the next slide there for me. So this is something I can't sort of like not do today. And it's the idea of, so back in the day, going back to the savannah, where one person just died because he didn't worry, and the other person, lived on because he did worry. That's not our reality anymore. Because like back then, when it came to cortisol production, when we became anxious and our body started producing cortisol, there were only two options. The one option was that we were dead, and then it didn't really matter if we, had our body full of cortisol. And the other option was that we would kind of like run or fight or do something physical to work this excellent amount of cortisol off. So these days, when we have a situation, most of the time where we get really anxious, it's, it's more likely for us to even sit down whilst we're having a very stressful conversation. While it's all the same, this cortisol in our bloodstream rises and we don't do anything normally to work it off. And the reason why that's a problem is because it kind of like over time it builds up, and that's when it kind of like gets into this vicious cycle of cortisol. So let's start at the very beginning of this cycle, which I just called anxiety at this point in time. So let's say for whatever reason you are in a situation where you feel anxious, so that body of yours produces cortisol. You do not work it off at that point in time, and you don't get eaten either. So that's the scenario right now. So that means the cortisol remains in your system. And what happens at this point in time, and that is really interesting actually, the way your body is impacted at that point in time is in the following. Your body, the barrier you have in your body when it comes to cortisol production lowers. So because you still have this excess amount of cortisol in your bloodstream, your body gets anxious more easily, essentially, because this threshold for your body to produce cortisol has been slightly changed. So for that reason, all of a sudden, something that would normally not have caused you any anxiety makes you feel anxious. And over time, the more often you go through this circle, the more, the easier it becomes for your body to feel anxious, essentially, and the more cortisol will be in your body. So then in my workshops, I develop exit strategies with the people I'm working with. And it's my understanding that there's two different exit strategies out of this vicious cycle of cortisol. But before I go into that, I just like to ask you guys one more time, did that make sense to you? This idea of the more you worry, the more you worry, the more you worry, because that cortisol kind of like does not get worked off.
Yeah, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Alrighty. So it's my understanding from the lens I'm wearing that there's two possible ways to exit this vicious cycle. And I think especially with the women we have on board today, you might have completely other knowledge and insights around that. So be really keen to hear about that as well. But I differentiate between two different things. And if you just go to the next slide for me, that'd be perfect. So I believe there's two exit strategies. One is around cognition and thinking style. And the other one is around physical activity. And by that, I don't necessarily only mean exercise. There might be various things. And what I always ask the people I work with to do is sort of like, first of all, that's back to interpretation, the initial thing I was saying, find out the reason why they worry and become mindful of that, more mindful of that. And then kind of like there's different thinking style strategies one can use in order to not even go into this, not even enter this vicious cycle of cortisol. So one of the ideas around cognition and thinking style is the idea of learning about the stimulus, the thing that usually gets you to worry, becoming really mindful of that. So for instance, some Shah already knows that I'm crazy about dogs, and so one thing that might kind of like get me worried right now, since I have a little puppy, my stimulus might be a bigger dog. So once I kind of like become aware of the fact that whenever there's a bigger dog around, I kind of like, get anxious, my body tenses up and so on and so forth. Once I'm aware of the stimulus, I can like almost take a step back again and realize, okay, there's a difference between the stimulus, the bigger dog, and my response. In the sense that in between these two, there's still this gap, which is my freedom to choose. And that's when I kind of like get, my bodily awareness back, and I can kind of like not make the same rigid decision over and over and over again. And by then kind of like really incentivize this vicious cycle of cortisol. The other one is when it comes to physically exiting that vicious cycle of cortisol, it depends on, and that's really important in my view, it depends on how you tick. So there's different ways to reduce cortisol levels, which is depending on what makes sense to you. Like for instance, one of the things I do when I know that for whatever reason, I have not been able to exit that vicious cycle early enough, and there is an excess amount of cortisol in my body, I watch comedy. Like that's one of my strategies, because I know as soon as I start laughing, my breathing changes, and as soon as my breathing changes, it increases my dopamine levels, and that changes around how much cortisol I have in my bloodstream. Same is true for singing, for instance. So it sounds a little bit crazy, but these are the kind of strategies I self-impose on myself almost when I feel that I have an excess amount of cortisol. The other thing, talking about dogs and stuff, what many people do as a result of doing this workshop on wearing as a hobby is they either think about getting a pet, or they just start volunteering in for charities that work with pets and stuff like that. Because at the end of the day, oxytocin, which is like in the in the magazines now, they call it the cuddle hormone. Oxytocin gets released when we are in contact with either animals or when we have hugs that are longer than 30 seconds. I thought it was hilarious. It always gives me a reason to hug people for longer than 30 seconds. So anyways, as soon as we have that physical interaction with either an animal or another animal, like human being, it does change up our levels of oxytocin. And oxytocin, the way oxytocin works very simply is it essentially eats cortisol for breakfast. So these strategies sound very simple, and that's exactly what they are. I think what's not simple, and what people do not do at this point in time, is seeking out these things very consciously. So when I am in a stressful situation, after that, I do my 4 physical burn-off things, for instance, in order to kind of get back to that status quo, or to that equilibrium in my body. And also the way that these different things, they impact the body differently. Like for instance, it says here about exercise. People think that exercise kind of like reduces cortisol. Yes, it does. But what it actually does, it increases that threshold again. The threshold I was talking about earlier, and when it came to the vicious cycle of cortisol, the threshold that gets lowered and lower the more cortisol we have in our body. That's a thing that kind of like gets higher again when we through exercise. So I think it's just, you know, an interesting thing to kind of like look about the different ways we can impact that from different angles, so to say. So the one thing I would like to leave you with today as a little bit of a to-do for you is the idea of, and Shah, if you could just go to the next slide for me there, of cortisol slayers, you know. What could your strategies be there? And the preventative care is everything around cognition, thinking style, not even entering the exit, not even entering the vicious cycle of cortisol. And the red card there, the acute care, that is everything to do with sort of like once you're already in that worry loop, what can you do for your body at that point in time to make sure you do not have this cortisol in your system for longer than it needs to be? And that's something, yeah, I would love for you to just take, you know, a couple of minutes to write down if you have the time today or maybe tomorrow. And it's something, when you go to the next slide, Charles, something that this is taken from one of my workshops where I ask people, you know, what their preventative care could be and what their acute care could be, or, you know, in other words the words that I used before, what are your cognitive strategies, what are your physical strategies there? And it was, you can't really read it, but I just wanted to show you with that slide that there are very different ways to do these two things. And what I find important is to find something that works for you. So my strategy is probably not relevant to you, might also not work for you. What is your strategy within this idea of cognitive, like thinking style, and with this physical response to excess levels of cortisol? Yeah. So that's the sort of like content I've got for you today. I could talk about this forever and ever, to be quite honest with you. But yeah, that's all we've got time for, I'm afraid. And now questions, Faye. I'm eager for questions.
I think you laid that out in a really accessible way. I go through this in an intro to meditation workshop I run, talking about cortisol and how we're all just on this kind of cortisol addicted cycle where we're always vibrating at this level and we never get back down. So I really liked how you presented that. And then I was laughing because whenever you were mentioning dogs, my dog would walk over and he was listening to you. And I was petting him. He knew, he could feel your vibes. He knew that you were an animal appreciator.
Yes, big time.
No, I love this. I just wanted to say Linda had to sneak off the call and she wanted to apologize to you, Chris. She didn't want to miss the end of it, so we'll be sure to share the recording with her. I wondered if you could. Could you say a little bit more about the difference between, I think I get it, the difference between preventative care is more cognitive and acute care is more physical, is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. If you could just go back to the vicious cycle for me, I can hopefully make it a bit clearer there.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, I have these two red dots in there. One is next to anxiety and one is next to not working it off enough. And so the first dot next to anxiety, that's when it comes to the exit strategy, that's almost like you don't even get into the anxiety. So I believe through thinking styles and really learning about different thinking styles, you know, over time you can learn not to actually get into the vicious cycle of cortisol.
Mm-hmm.
But this is maybe, and that's why I say, you know, the other one is the acute care, because sometimes when people are in that worry habit, it's great to say, you know, you can just think about it differently. It all depends on your values. That's not really helpful, right? So depending on where you're at, I differentiate between these two. And so essentially, when it comes to cognition, and I do a whole workshop just on positive mental strategies, it's very much on what can we do in order to interpret a trigger for anxiety in a different way.
Mm-hmm.
And then I talk about, for instance, perceptive filters. The perceptive filters we all have, like deletion, distortion, generalization. These are the things that on the one hand, they keep us sane in order for us to make sense of our world and the things around us, we need to delete stuff. And at any given point in time, there's like 7,000 stimuli that want to be heard. And if it wasn't for our brain's ability to delete out 80% of these stimuli in our environment, then we would just go bonkers, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we oftentimes delete out things that would, for instance, make us feel less anxious. So it's this whole idea about like, so how do I think? Like what kind of things do I delete? Which kind of things do I distort based on these perceptive filters in my brain? And then, over time, creating this awareness. And by then, over time, and this is where both other pieces of my work come in, sustainable habit change and positive mental strategies. How can we work on this together to just change this initial experience of anxiety? But that's like quite advanced. But that is definitely there. That is one way of coping with anxiety, is to learn to interpret these things differently. But then the other thing is, and that's the acute care I'm talking about there. So the other one was preventative care, for you not to even enter this vicious cycle. But when I talk about acute care, then it's everything to do with changing up the level of cortisol in your body with the help of different vehicles. May it be physical touch, in order to get that oxytocin up. May it be exercise in order to, pull up this threshold for cortisol production again. May it be dopamine levels, all these things. Like, it's almost like, I think of it as having a great diet when it comes to hormones that reduce the experience your body has through through cortisol toxification. Does it make it a bit clearer?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it does. It does. Yeah, it's really interesting. That's for sure.
Yeah, fascinating.
Jenna, do you have any questions?
I don't. I think the layout was really great.
Awesome.
Nice coverage. Great job.
Very, very interesting. Thank you so much. Well, we'll be sure to share it with the other ladies that were not on the call. We have a few more minutes. I want to be respectful of your time. We said that we'd be done by 2:30. I'm just wondering if there's, I am going to just stop our recording.